Hey everybody, my name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And you're listening to the Personality Hacker Podcast. We thought we'd do an experiment this week. We're actually traveling, and we stopped to get some coffee a few minutes ago. We thought, let's do an experiment. And the first person we run into, let's ask them what they would love to listen to in a podcast, and then see if we can bring some models and of human development around whatever topic they suggest.
Right. So totally random topic.
Just a random person that we would ask.
So there were actually two people making our drinks, our coffee drinks. And we asked both of them what they would like to listen to if they were going to listen to any topic, on a podcast. And they both said simultaneously, they said sex, which is not surprising since sex is on most people's mind most of the time. And that made me think of two things. It made me think of that House of Cards quote. Remember that?
Oh, yeah.
The character in House of Cards,
Frank Underwood
in the it's a Netflix original series. So if you've never seen it, you can only get it if you have Netflix, and it's a show. I don't want to call it a TV show because Netflix isn't TV, but it's a show that was produced through Netflix.
It's like a mini-series almost.
Yeah, exactly. And the main character's name is Frank Underwood, and he's just this totally ruthless politician who is climbing, biting, scratching his way to the top. And he has a great quote that he tells somebody who he ends up in a sexual relationship with. He says that, what was the quote? You actually quoted it perfectly.
He says, everything is about sex, except for sex. That's about power. Which I thought was a great quote.
Yeah, it's such a great quote. And it's really interesting to think about. And maybe that'll come up later.
And what he's ostensibly saying is everything's about power because he's in a powerful position in Washington. He's trying to gain more power and stuff.
Right. However, the vehicle to power is often sex.
Absolutely.
And the other thing it made me think of was in the book Prometheus Rising by Robert Anton Wilson. Wilson talks about what's called the 8 Circuit model, which he took from Timothy Leary. And the 8 Circuit model is really interesting, but the one circuit that I really wanted to focus in on, especially talking about sex, is called the 4th Circuit. And the 4th Circuit is Socio-Sexual. Now, what the circuits are is they are time periods in our life where our brain becomes vulnerable to imprinting. Mm-hmm. So the first 4 circuits happen throughout our early developmental process. Like the first circuit's called the biosurvival circuit, and that's whether or not we perceive the world as friendly or threatening or hostile, and that happens around the time period that we start breastfeeding. That's when we get imprinted with the world is friendly or hostile. The second circuit is called the anal territorial circuit, and that is our perception of dominance. So it's around the time period that we get up and we start walking around and we start discovering who's big man on campus.
The pecking order.
Yeah, what's the pecking order in our house?
Yeah.
And that happens around the time that we start walking, basically, and that's the anal territorial. And the question is, am I dominant or am I submissive? And then the third circuit's called the time-binding circuit. And these are generally the beliefs that we tend to imprint as sort of our family beliefs and the beliefs we're supposed to believe. And this happens around the age of like 7 or 8 when we really start opening ourselves up to what's the ideology of our family or what's the ideology of the society that we're in. And it's called time binding because it's about knowledge and information that is bound through time, through written word and through stories and that sort of thing. And then the 4th circuit's called the Socio-Sexual circuit. And the imprint that happens here is around the time period of puberty. And this is the time when we get imprinted with whatever our sexual preferences, our orientation, our paraphilias, which are maybe even exclusive things that turn us on, our fetishes. These all happen during the 4th Circuit imprinting phase. Mm-hmm. And that makes sense that it happens around puberty. But what's fascinating is it's not the sexual circuit, it's the socio-sexual circuit, indicating that there is an intrinsic link between the things that turn us on, our sexual imprint, and where we see ourselves in society.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that well, I had a conversation with my 8-year-old son this past week. We kind of had a sex talk last summer, because I know in grade school now you kind of get the whole, kids are saying stuff younger and younger every year. So I thought it was really important to have a sex talk last year, and we just happened to be talking about some more sex stuff this last time I was visited with him, and it came up to the point I don't even know how we got on this topic. Somehow we get on the topic of animals being fixed, like dogs, neutered basically, and this kind of thing. And I remember he was like, "Why?" And I said, "Well, it's population control. It's how to control animals." And I said, back in the olden days, a long time ago, they actually controlled people through the same methods, through castration. And I explained to him how that worked, and he was like, "Wow." So I said, "That's kind of how it happens." And I said, "And now what happens is there's no actual physical castration that people are okay with in most developed countries, but it's done through your mind. It's a castration of your mind. It's controlling your sexual behavior to get a desired outcome socially in our culture and culturally." And he was really fascinated by this, because he's a little intuitive.
Right.
And he was really like, "Oh, wow." And so he was, even today we saw a dog and he was pointing some things out and talking about it. But this is really fascinating to him to understand that socially, things are controlled through the use of sexuality and reproduction, basically.
Yeah. Well, Wilson says in the book that the only rule about sexuality is that there's going to be rules about sexuality. That's the only rule. Otherwise, it's a totally wide open game. What we get imprinted with is as, it's as... There's so much variety there. Well, there's people who are into shoes, and there's into people who are stepping with their shoes on Cheetos, and there are people who are into pimple popping, and there are people who are into...
totally.
What's that?
Oh, totally. And what the weird thing is, though...
Ankles, nose, etc.
Most people, and you and I have talked about this, most people spend their entire life trying to conform to whatever the social conditioning is of the culture around them.
Well, that's the thing. We all have a variety of sexualized fetishes and paraphilias and things that really turn us on. But there's usually just one that's socially acceptable, right? Like usually there's just one form of sexuality that society has decided is appropriate or okay. And Wilson says most of, 99% of the population spend their entire lives pretending to have that be their imprint. When really only 1% of the population generally has that as their imprint. So the only rule about sexuality is that there's going to be rules about sexuality.
Yeah.
And so really our imprint is intrinsically linked to where we see ourselves in society. Are we appropriate? Are we normal? Are we abnormal? Are we into something that society says is not okay? I mean, look at the varieties of pornography available online. And do we think of everybody who's not into simply missionary style sex between two heterosexuals, everybody else is a dirty, dirty pervert, right? Mm-hmm. That would make most people dirty, dirty perverts. And that's the interesting thing, is that a lot of people who don't have the imprint that is quote unquote acceptable to society will see themselves as a dirty, dirty pervert.
Sure. The other, I mean, more than pornography, I've only seen a couple of these in my life, but I think I have enough experience to make a pattern out of it. There's these surveys in magazines, particularly women's magazines like Cosmo, and it's like, average is this, and how do you fit in the average? How do you align with the rest of culture in this thing you like about men, or this thing you like about women, or your relationship? Is your relationship normal or abnormal? It's like this almost cultural survey that's trying to kind of get everybody on the same page to judge themselves against. I mean, you've probably seen more women's magazines than I have. Is this something that's common, like kind of a socially constructed questionnaire that moves people through kind of adjusting themselves to what culture sees as normal?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a specific memory of a quiz like that, but I have seen, I've seen things that are similar, which is, I think everybody's really interested in what normal is. Yeah. They're really interested in knowing whether or not they fit the norm. It's really important to us. And I think that goes back to a time period where if we were too outside the box, if we were too unacceptable, we could get booted from the tribe. And getting booted from the tribe was tantamount to a death sentence.
Yeah.
I think we've talked about that in previous podcasts, that it's not okay to get booted by the tribe. Like, that's not all right. And so we really want to know if we're kind of falling in to the normal category. We want to know if we're like standing too much outside, like getting too much attention for our differences. And we want to know that we're going to be okay. And I think what's fascinating about this too is there are those of us that are not quote unquote, whatever normal means, right? We're not quote unquote normal or normalized in society. And we'll spend sometimes more passion and resource into demonizing other people who are not normal than somebody who maybe saw themselves as normal and didn't even recognize that the quote unquote, the different people exist. Mm-hmm. And I think it's because we have so much personal shame. Like, I think this is sort of that old stereotype of the homophobe, right? That ends up being gay themselves, right? Like, gets arrested for hiring, male prostitutes or something. Some politician or some, Christian leader or something that was like massively, reviling the gay lifestyle and then ends up being gay themselves.
Yeah.
And I think it's because we have a hard time making peace with whether or not our desires fall in line with whatever we believe is socially appropriate for whatever society we're in. And so we're going to double down on making sure that everybody knows that we're not okay with this.
Yeah. And we're normal. I'm normal. Don't think I'm abnormal.
Right. If we just kind of opened ourselves up to not being normal, like if there was a rule that at one point everybody had to reveal what their sexual fetish was or their sexual paraphilia or whatever turns them on, like there was a rule that everybody had to reveal that, I think we would be just blown away by what variety there is in what turns us on.
Yeah. I think of something I heard last week, and I forget where I even heard this. It was a quote, and if a listener can let me know where this source is, because I read and look and hear so much. I can't remember where I hear stuff half the time. So this is not my thought, but somebody said, if you can't talk about sex, you probably shouldn't be having it. And it keyed me into thinking, like, people, there are so many people, when we're talking about this idea, there are so many people that they have so many strong opinions about something they're unwilling to even really discuss. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of like, if you want to have a strong opinion about something, I feel like you should be just open to discussion about whatever that opinion is. Mm-hmm. And, and then a lot of times kids, when you're growing up, you might, as parents might have a difficult time talking about sex in front of their children, or, the whole like socially acceptable part of talking about sex makes people feel weird or nervous. And then it's like, kind of like people get this jacked up notion like, oh, this is dirty or secretive, I shouldn't be discussing this. And so then any kind of feelings, it kind of reinforces that shame piece that you're talking about, where people are like, oh man, this is something I'm struggling with. And it might not even be, I mean, it's benign stuff, but it just makes you feel like you can't speak about it. And I think that's and at the same time, sorry, I keep rambling here, but at the same time, also, I have a little bit of a sense of propriety. I think, and you and I probably differ on this because you're a thinker, I'm a feeler. I have a sense of like, it does bother me when people are a little too cavalier about discussion about sex, and I think there is some specialness to it in my mind, and this is how I approach it. Again, there is no normal here, right? But that's just me, and that's kind of how I see it. And so I understand that people do have sense of like, well, I don't want to discuss this at the dinner table, like your fetish you might have or something. Like I can understand how people have that kind of thing, and I think, like you said, also they have a tendency not to feel like. They might have secret desires that if it's spoken about now, they might feel bad about, so they want to suppress that kind of thing. Sex is a tough issue for a lot of people, though. I think it's definitely something it makes them feel vulnerable and open, and they don't know how to deal with that kind of vulnerability in life and discussion. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if you're going to find a source for that quote, because I think I read it on Reddit.
Oh, okay. And it's probably just a Reddit comment.
Yeah, I think it was. And I think the subject was, how young is too young to have sex or something to that effect. And they were saying, well, if you're not old enough to have a mature conversation around sex, you're probably not old enough to be having sex.
Yeah.
So it was mostly about
the age level
of maturity of people who, quote unquote, should be having sex. What I find interesting about all this too is that we sometimes, we sometimes overvalue the importance of sex, and then we sometimes diminish the importance of sex. I don't really think it's something that, necessarily, quote unquote, should be thrown out at just a dinner party. And I'm using the word, every time I say the word should, I put air quotes around it.
I see them.
Yeah.
The audience doesn't see them, but I see them.
Well, I'm saying quote unquote because I almost feel like the word should is kind of a ridiculous word. Like, reality doesn't really care what I think should be the case. Like, shoulds are not something that reality gives, two craps about.
A hurricane shouldn't have hit New Orleans.
Right.
But
yeah, that person should think this thing. Yeah, well, okay, and they're not. They don't think that thing. Yeah. So it doesn't really matter what should be. That said, it's really fascinating around the topic of sex, and what we should be revealing or not revealing, etc. Because I don't really think it's whether or not we should be having like lots of open conversation with each other. We're at a place in society where I don't know if we're really ready for that. I think we're probably gaining readiness for that when we have growing transparency. In fact, that kind of makes me think of our podcast on transparency, like how much information is too much information. Mm-hmm. As we have a growing sense of transparency, those conversations will be less and less, offensive, or we'll feel less self-conscious around them, or we won't. Maybe that's a topic that we'll always kind of have some, self-consciousness around. I think it's more sort of on a mimetic level of whether or not we recognize in groupthink, right? Like sort of the mind viruses that we pass back and forth to each other, whether or not people all view sex the same, which we have in the past enforced a sense of. Like the forced meme was we should all view sex the same. So we were all forced to by the big institutions that were running things, politics, religion, etc. The forced meme or mind virus is that we should all think of sex and then fill in the blank. Mm-hmm. Right? Like whatever society said at the time. Wilson in the book Prometheus Rising says in some cultures it was that you should marry your sibling, right? Like Egyptian royalty, they had to marry their siblings if they had a sibling, all the way over to marrying your cousin is icky, right? And ew, who would marry their cousin, right? So there's always been some predominant concept around what's acceptable sexuality or not. And everybody just kind of had to follow suit. And because the world is so open now, like our ability to transfer information is so quick, and there are so many voices that are being heard, we are more and more understanding that people's sexuality is different because people are revealing that in internet chat rooms, on forums, in a environment where they feel safe and anonymous. We're getting more and more information that people think things very differently. And so because we see a lot of transparency coming out through anonymity, now individuals are getting more and more bolstered to reveal their sexuality with a anonymous, sort of position. They're like, no, I feel this way and I have no self-consciousness around it. And so society now looks different than society in the past because it's much more difficult to control how people, quote unquote, should be thinking. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter what people should be thinking. It matters what people are thinking. And they're thinking so many different things, and they're revealing that now. And now we don't necessarily, you can really see the backlash against that. You can really see sort of the religious right coming at it, right? Like, no, we should all see sexuality in this very specific way. Or it doesn't even have to be the religious right. It could be, people coming from the other direction going, no, we should all view sexuality as totally open. There's all these should statements. Mm-hmm. And so you can really see there's a backlash against this concept of openness and letting people, sort of reveal whatever their personal imprint is. But I think it's less important to talk about it on a micro level and more important to talk about it on a macro level. Like, are we going to continue to be so married to a societal concept of sexuality? And are we going to continue to see ourselves as broken or flawed when we pit our personal preferences and our orientations against whatever we think society is telling us we should be?
Yeah. A couple things come to mind as you're talking. One is, several. and I don't want to go off on too many tangents. One is the fact that are these all these sexual preferences that we're speaking of, have they always been here, all like in the history of the world, or because of things like pornography and new cultural like intertwinings in the global communities we have, are we actually developing more appetites than we've ever had as humans before? That's one thought I've had, one question I've had. And I don't know, that's probably a whole nother podcast. But that's a question I had. I'm sure there's some of that, people are actually developing new tastes that they wouldn't have developed 200 years ago because they didn't have maybe a pornographic image or video around whatever that taste is. Like, whoa, that's interesting to me. And now they're developing a taste for this when they didn't have it before. The other thing that comes to mind is I read a book about 10 years ago by Berger and Luckman, I forget their first names, called The Social Construction of Reality. And it was a great book, and basically it posits that all reality is socially constructed. Everything, and this is kind of what we're talking about. It's like the idea of what we have about sex, it's been socially constructed in our culture, and it has been like one or two definitions, basically. This kind of very narrowly defined, socially constructed idea around sex. And the question I have around that is, if you don't have a social construction around sex and everyone gets to make up their own rules per se, will that make transaction, or the word transactions, but relation between people, if you don't know what the rule is, it's hard to interact. Like, you kind of want to know, like in our culture, for example, if you go up and you shake someone's hand, we kind of know there's a social constructed rule that it's not a rule, it's a behavior. We shake people's hands.
You're not supposed to pat them on the butt.
We don't come, but in Europe, you go up and you kiss on cheeks, and it's a very different social construction, how you interact socially. Yeah, you don't pat them on the butt. It's just this different way of behaving in different cultures, and that's a simple example to say. And I know that sex isn't necessarily interaction behaviorally, but it is to some degree, because think about, as a listener, think about every day when you're going out, you usually make yourself look nice and you dress up, and if there's somebody of the opposite sex, if that's what you're attracted to, or somebody of the same sex, if that's what you're attracted to, and they're kind of around you and they catch your eye, you kind of perk up, you might stand up a little straight. I've seen this happen, like a 40-year-old dude sucks his gut in and he stands up straighter, and he kind of starts kind of peacocking a little bit in front of a young girl that's attractive to him. We see this all the time, and I do it, you do it, we all do this. This is what we do as humans. If there's so much openness to all this, are we going to lose a sense of how do we interact in the world? And then what do we fill that vacuum with? How do we go about life if this becomes so open framed? Is that a question that you understand what I'm asking or positing out there?
Totally. Well, I mean,
not that you have the answer. But
I don't know if I have the answer.
It's a great discussion starter, isn't it?
Yeah, but I would say that as far as the first question goes, I do think that maybe we probably have paraphilias that may not have existed before.
They're being developed through stuff. Yeah,
because we have imprints based on what's happening in the moment, and there might be new things that exist now that haven't in the past. So it's entirely possible that new, say, paraphilias are popping up. That said, there is something to be said for there's nothing new under the sun, and especially in relationship to sex, right? My guess is that if there are new ones, there's not that many.
Or it's a variation of a principled attraction before.
Exactly. And as far as the second question goes, I don't think we will ever get away from social constructions of reality. Necessarily, or at least we won't for a long, long, long time, way past the time that the people living now will ever know that. That's my guess. My assumption is that we're going to have social constructed reality for a very long time as humans. And that's a nice thing. Social construction of reality, like you said, helps us create unspoken social contracts that ensure a more pleasant ride through life. Mm-hmm. It's not so much that a socially constructed reality is bad. It's when we don't recognize that it's a socially constructed reality and our self-esteem is negatively impacted by, this idea that we're not fitting the mold and we're somehow bad, right? I'm bad or broken because I'm not fitting whatever societal mold is around me. If you understand that reality is socially constructed, it's a lot easier to go, well, that just happens to be the rules of the game that I'm in right now in this particular country or in this particular state or this particular county in this particular time period. And it makes things a little more open.
I think people do understand those rules, actually. I think and that's why we hide if we have fetishes and things. That's
Yeah.
why we do understand that it's socially constructed, I guess, at the core of our being, and that we've got to play to these rules that have been put around us.
Yeah.
And the people that go outside those oftentimes are socially ostracized and punished to some degree, or just they feel like kind of, ugh.
Yeah, I mean, I think we know the rules of the game, but that doesn't mean that we don't overvalue those rules.
Correct.
Right? Like, we don't want to undervalue them by saying that they're meaningless, right? But at the same time, we don't want to overvalue them by saying this is universal reality. Because the rules of social construction, the rules of social, these unspoken social contracts, they change over time. They morph. Again, Egyptian leaders were supposed to marry siblings, and now in the country that we live in, it's like icky and gross if you marry your cousin. So that certainly changed, right? So it is good to remember that things will change over time. One thing, though, that is coming up for me as we're talking is this idea that if you control somebody's sexuality, you control their minds. Yeah. And I think that's why for so long it's been so important to describe or define or create these rules around sexuality. Mm-hmm. When you control how they see themselves as sexual creatures, and if you can control how they have sex, which is really actually controlling how they reproduce. Yeah. Controlling sexuality doesn't mean anything if you aren't actually, I mean, if you look at it just in and of itself. I mean, there could be some things about like controlling people's ability to have pleasure or whatever, but it's really about controlling reproduction. Yeah. And that, I mean, it doesn't matter how free we get. You can see arguments around that all over the place. This is the fundamental core of the abortion debates. Yeah. This is the fundamental core about whether or not, gay couples should be able to have children. This is the fundamental argument around whether or not we should say in some countries, like it's okay to say you can only have one child, or, whether or not we should sterilize some. This is the whole concept of eugenics, etc. So it's really about controlling reproduction. And you can see how powerful this has been in the past. Like, look at the Catholic Church when
Talking
they...
about the past? What are you talking about the past? Holy crap.
You can see from the past how powerful it is, and then be able to apply it to what's going on now.
How we got here, basically.
That's right. Using it as sort of a metaphor, or an not analogy, because it actually, it happened, but like using it as a way to understand how this could be powerful now, but in more subtle ways. I was thinking about the Catholic Church saying that every, wealthy family or family of any note basically had to have one of their children become a priest. And then what happens when that priest dies? Well, whatever came to that child, inheritance-wise, then when the priest died, all of that got donated to the Catholic Church. And so, or not donated, but they just took it. So of all the noble families, they're getting a third of inheritance, or a fourth of inheritance, or how many ever kids there were. They were getting a chunk of change every time that person died. And so then their territories, their lands just got enormous. Like, they owned everything after a while. Yeah. And it was because they told them that they couldn't marry. I guess early on in the Catholic Church's lifespan, priests married all the time. It was no problem that priests married and had children. But at a certain point, they kind of realized that they had a lot of financial benefit to putting the kibosh on that. And then suddenly they were extremely powerful and wealthy. Yeah. So, I mean, that's just one example. And that's not by any means the worst example. Like, I mean, that's just kind of like that's an understandable example of using people's sexuality for power, or to gain power. But there are like some really terrible examples out there where like basically when you control people's sexuality, you controlled their minds, you controlled their money, etc.
Well, like we mentioned the quote earlier that Frank Underwood in House of Cards says, everything's about sex except for sex. That's about power. And you just gave a great example of sex utilized for power play. Mm-hmm. And I think that what is interesting to me is that most people, and I mean, this has been me for my life. I've done this too. You've done this. I'm sure if you're listening, you've done this. You go through life and you're not aware of what's happening. Like, you're not aware of some of these things. And when you start to realize that this is, sexuality is such an important part of every human's experience, every mammal's experience, heck, even plants. I mean, reproduction is part of life. It is life-giving, it's life-affirming, and it's life movement forward. It's how we are here from our ancestors, because they had sex and we're here now. Mm-hmm. Like, the seed was passed on. The genetic code was passed on. It really it encompasses so much of our lives. When we ask two random people, Sam and Tony, that are making our coffee, they say, hey, this is on top of my mind.
Right, sex.
I mean, it's really important. It's really top of mind, and it's something that, there's a lot more discussion, a lot more thought about, and a lot more control tactics. I mean, it encompasses so much. It's really an interesting viewpoint when you open yourself up to see what's really happening under the surface of what is culturally normal, and if you deviate from that, are you the only one?
Right.
And that's a feeling I think everybody has to some degree.
Yeah, and I think sort of if I was going to encapsulate this entire conversation into one meaningful takeaway, it would be, if you aren't, like, whatever society tells you is the normal sexuality. And I think what's interesting is that, we live in the United States, which has 50 different states and has so many different cultures, right? Like, the culture of Southern California is totally different than the culture of New York, right? Mm-hmm. Like, the culture of Oregon, where I'm from, is totally different than the culture of Western Pennsylvania, where I'm currently living, right? So the cultures change. That said, whatever the culture is of the area that you're in, if your sexuality doesn't perfectly match whatever that culture's rules are about sex, or what they tell you you're supposed to be experiencing sexually, or what's supposed to turn you on, cut yourself some slack, because you're part of the majority, of the overwhelming majority. 99% of the people on the planet do not have the sexual imprint that society tells them they're supposed to have, whatever that society is. That society is.
It may not be super, freaky or weird or anything like that, but it's definitely going to be different than the neighbor. I mean, It just is. We're individuals.
Yeah.
Like, none of us like anything the same. Everything's different. Like, we're all different, unique people.
Well, and you have to remember that these imprints are beyond your control. They're happening at certain time periods in your life where your brain is particularly vulnerable for an imprint. And it's totally accidental. Whatever that imprint is, it's just something that happened, right? Like, you just happen to, Wilson talks about some guy who was, just about ready to have sex for the first time in the backseat of a car. And just as he was getting to the point where he was about to climax, some policeman knocked on the window, right, to tell these two teenagers that were pawing at each other to move along. And that totally got imprinted for him. Yeah. Like, to a point where he almost couldn't have sex later on in life because he was so anxious around it. He could have controlled that. That was totally accidental. All the way over, to people who, have different fetishes or paraphilias based on just like their genitals happen to have pressure at that moment when something happened, and it was a pleasurable sensation, and now it's
tied to that event.
Like, you really, it's kind of accidental, and you really don't choose it. So, if it's not the same as the people around you, or whatever is being told that, that is the people around you's imprint, which is probably not that, just cut yourself some slack. It's going to be okay. It's going to be just fine.
So thoughts, we want to hear from you. We want to hear some feedback about, if you want, I don't even know if I want to ask if you want to post about your experiences. I don't, it's like, just come over to Personality Hacker, and we'll engage in as best we can around this.
An online conversation around this.
Oh man, what did I just open us to? Personalityhacker.com. It's facebook.com/personalityhacker, or twitter.com/personalityhack. We're going to talk to you in the next episode. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And this has been the Personality Hacker Podcast.